For 37 years, Michael Reynolds carried the weight of his father's memory like a stone in his pocket. Always there, always heavy, yet never examined in the light. The day they buried Thomas Reynolds was cold, the kind of bitter January, morning where breath hangs visible in the air, and mourners huddle closer than they might otherwise. Michael stood at the back of the crowd, watching as they lowered his father's casket into the frozen ground of Pine Grove Cemetery. He was 32 then, established in his career as an architect, married for just under 5 years to a woman named Lisa, who squeezed his hand throughout the service. Lisa didn't understand why Michael positioned them so far back, why he declined to throw a handful of dirt onto the casket, or why he was the first to leave after the final prayers were spoken. She couldn't have understood. Michael himself wasn't. Sure, he understood. "You don't have to say anything," Thomas's old army buddy had told Michael at the reception afterward, clapping a meaty hand on his shoulder. "Your dad knew how complicated things were between you two." Did he, though? Michael had wondered, nodding politely as he accepted condolences from people who seemed to have known his father better than he ever had. Had Thomas Reynolds, decorated, Air Force colonel, strict disciplinarian and perpetual disappointed father, ever truly understood why his only son had grown so distant? On the drive home from the funeral, Lisa had suggested they stop by the cemetery the following weekend once the grave marker was in place. "It might help with closure," she'd said gently. Michael had stared straight ahead at the road and changed the subject. In the weeks that followed, he made a private promise to himself. He would never visit that grave. The funeral had been obligation enough. The years rolled forward. Michael and Lisa welcomed twin daughters, Claire and Abby, who grew into curious, bright-eyed girls who sometimes asked about the grandfather they'd never met. Michael kept his answers brief, factual. He was in the Air Force. He flew planes in Vietnam. He liked fishing. What he didn't say: how Thomas had criticized every report card that wasn't perfect, how he'd mocked Michael's interest in architecture as drawing pretty pictures for a living, how the rare moments of his father's approval felt like winning an Olympic medal, precious because they were so scarce. Lisa kept a few family photos on display, including one of Thomas in his uniform, but Michael never looked at them directly. When his mother called on the anniversary of Thomas's death each year, Michael would listen patiently but find reasons to cut the conversation short. "You should talk to the girls more about your father," his mother said once when the twins were about 10. "They deserve to know their heritage." "What's there to know, Mom?" Michael had replied more sharply than he'd intended. That he thought I was a disappointment from day one? That nothing I ever did was good enough? That kind of heritage? His mother had gone quiet on the other end of the line. "He was proud of you, Michael, he just didn't know how to show it." Michael had heard that excuse his entire life. It rang as hollow at 45 as it had at 15. By the time Michael reached his late 60s, his life had settled into comfortable patterns. The architecture firm he'd founded had grown successful enough that he could step back into a consulting role. Lisa had retired from teaching, and they'd moved to a smaller house with a view of the mountains. Their daughters were grown with families of their own: Claire, a pediatrician in Boston, Abby running a graphic design company in Chicago. They visited for holidays and called weekly. Michael's life was full, happy by any reasonable measure. His mother had passed away 5 years earlier, after a brief illness. Michael had handled her affairs with quiet efficiency, sorting through her modest possessions and selling the small house where she'd lived since Thomas's death. Unlike with his father, Michael visited his mother's grave regularly, bringing fresh flowers and spending quiet moments telling her about Claire's children or Abby's latest big client. The contrast wasn't lost on him, 69 years old, and still sorting through the complicated tangle of feelings about a man who'd been gone for nearly 4 decades. "Dad never talks about Grandpa Thomas," Michael overheard Claire telling Abby during a Thanksgiving visit. "Mom says it's because they had a falling out or something." "I asked him once," Abby had replied, "when I was doing that family history project in high school. He just said some relationships are too complicated to explain." Michael had paused in the hallway, a stack of dinner plates in his hands, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that came with any mention of his father. What would he say if they asked him directly? That he'd spent most of his life trying to be everything Thomas Reynolds wasn't? That he'd measured his success as a father by how different he was from his own? The phone call came on an ordinary Tuesday in April. Michael was in his home office reviewing plans for a community center his firm was designing when Lisa appeared in the doorway. "There's a man on the phone," she said, looking puzzled. "He says he knew your father, someone named Frank Wilson." Michael stared at her. The name meant nothing to him. "What does he want?" He didn't say, just that it was important and personal. With reluctance, Michael took the call. The voice on the other end was rough, aged with the slight drawl of someone from the South. "Mr. Reynolds? My name's Frank Wilson. I served with your father in Vietnam, 1969 through 71. "I see," Michael said, his voice neutral. "What can I do for you, Mr. Wilson?" There was a pause, then. "I'm dying, Mr. Reynolds. Cancer. Doctors give me maybe 3 months. I've been tying up loose ends, making peace where I can. Your father's been on my mind a lot." Michael's fingers tightened around the phone. "I'm sorry to hear about your health, but my father has been gone for a long time now." 37 years, Frank said immediately. "I know, I've kept track. Look, I wouldn't bother you, but I found something when I was clearing out my storage unit. Letters your father wrote to me after we got back. I think you should have them." "Letters?" Michael repeated, something cold settling in his stomach. "He wrote to me for years. We were close. Went through some rough times together over there. Sometimes it's easier to say things to someone who's seen you at your worst." Frank's breathing was audible, slightly labored. "He talked about you a lot in those letters." Michael sat down heavily in his office chair. "I don't mean to be rude, Mr. Wilson, but my father and I weren't close. I'm not sure what you think these letters might—" "He kept every newspaper clipping," Frank interrupted. "Every time your name appeared anywhere, when you graduated college, when you won that design award, when your firm opened, he had a file an inch thick. In one letter, he described walking by your office building at night, just looking up at it, too nervous to go in and tell you he thought it was impressive as hell." The room seemed suddenly airless. Michael found himself unable to speak. "I know it's not my place," Frank continued, "but when a man is dying, he gets certain privileges. One of them is speaking painful truths. Your father was a complicated man, Mr. Reynolds. He was hard and demanding and terrible at showing affection. But he loved you fiercely, in his broken way." Michael closed his eyes, his free hand gripping the edge of his desk. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I made a promise once that if I outlived Tom, I'd make sure his son knew the truth. I've been a coward about it for too long." Frank coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "The letters are yours if you want them. And there's something else. Something he asked me to do if he died before he worked up the courage himself." "What's that?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "He wanted me to take you to his grave. Said you'd probably never go otherwise, and he couldn't blame you for it." Frank paused. "I've never been there myself. Feels wrong somehow. But I'd like to go before I can't anymore. And I think maybe you should too." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of decades, of unspoken words and missed chances. Michael thought of the stone he'd carried all these years, how he'd never once examined it properly, afraid of what he might see. "I need to think about this," he finally said. "Of course," Frank replied. "I'm staying at the Ridgeview Hotel downtown for the next week, room 214. The letters will be waiting for you, whether you decide to meet me or not." After hanging up, Michael sat motionless at his desk for a long time, staring at nothing. Lisa found him there an hour later, still holding the silent phone. "Who was that?" she asked softly, concern etching her features. Michael looked up at his wife of 42 years, the woman who had stood beside him through everything, who had never pushed him to reconcile with ghosts he wasn't ready to face. "Someone who knew my father," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Someone who says I might not have known him at all." Michael didn't tell Lisa about the letters that night. He moved through dinner with mechanical motions, responding to her questions about his day with short answers that trailed into silence. Later, as they sat in the living room, Lisa with her book, Michael pretending to watch the evening news, she finally set her reading aside and looked at him directly. "Whatever that Frank Wilson said to you has turned you into a ghost," she said gently. "You've been somewhere else all evening." Michael rubbed his hand across his face. 42 years of marriage had made hiding things from Lisa nearly impossible. She knew his expressions, his silences, the subtle shifts in his posture that signaled inner turmoil. "He says my father kept track of my career," Michael finally said, his voice low. "Collected newspaper clippings, stood outside my office building, once just looking up at it." Lisa watched him carefully. "And you don't believe him?" "I don't know what to believe." Michael turned to face her fully. "You remember what I've told you about my father? The man who made me feel like I was never good enough, who called architecture a hobby even after I started my own firm." "I remember," Lisa nodded. "I also remember your mother saying he was proud of you, in his own way." Michael shook his head. "Mom always tried to smooth things over, make excuses for him." "Maybe." Lisa reached for his hand. "Or maybe she saw something you couldn't." That night, Michael barely slept. He kept thinking about the file Frank had mentioned, an inch thick with clippings about his career achievements. Why would a disappointed father do that? The Thomas. Reynolds, he knew, would have scoffed at such sentimentality. The military man who'd raised him valued discipline and achievement, not feelings. Certainly not pride in a son who'd chosen a path so different from his own. The next morning, after Lisa left for her weekly volunteer shift at the community garden, Michael found himself driving downtown. He hadn't decided to go. His body seemed to make the choice for him. Before he fully registered what he was doing, he was parking near the Ridgeview Hotel, a modest 3-story building with faded brick and clean windows. Room 214 was at the end of a carpeted hallway that smelled faintly of cleaning products. Michael stood outside the door for a full minute before knocking, his heart pounding like he was a teenager again, preparing to face his father's judgment after staying out past curfew. The man who opened the door was thin, almost gaunt, with deep lines etched into a tanned face. He wore a plaid button-up shirt that hung loosely on his frame, and despite the obvious toll of illness, he stood straight, with the unmistakable bearing of a military man. "Mr. Reynolds," he said, a smile spreading across his face. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I'm not sure myself," Michael admitted. Frank Wilson gestured him inside. The hotel room was neat, with few personal belongings visible except for a weathered leather suitcase in the corner and a stack of prescription bottles on the nightstand. On the small desk by the window sat a cardboard box about the size that might hold reams of printer paper. "That's all of it," Frank said, following Michael's gaze. 30 years of letters, plus what he saved about you." Michael approached the box cautiously as if it might contain something dangerous. In a way it did. The potential to upend everything he thought he knew about his relationship with his father. "Why did he write to you?" Michael asked, not yet touching the box. "Why not just call?" Frank lowered himself carefully into the room's single armchair. "Your father wasn't good with talking, not about real things. Put him in front of a squadron, he could give orders all day. Ask him to tell you how he felt." Frank shook his head. "Different story." "That I remember," Michael said dryly. "After Vietnam, a lot of us couldn't talk about what happened over there. Not to civilians, not even to family. But sometimes we could write it down for each other." Frank gestured to the box. "That started as him working through war stuff. Over time, it turned into more." Michael finally reached for the box, lifting the lid. Inside were stacks of envelopes yellowed with age, each one addressed in his father's distinctive, precise handwriting. Beneath them was a manila folder, thicker than the rest, with Michael written on the tab. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the folder. Inside, just as Frank had described, were newspaper clippings, magazine articles, and printed web pages, each one featuring Michael's name or his architecture firm. The earliest was from his college newspaper when he'd won a student design competition. The most recent was from only months before Thomas died, an article about a museum Michael had designed that had won a prestigious award. He was diagnosed 2 weeks after that last article came out, Frank said quietly. Aggressive pancreatic cancer. He was gone 8 weeks later. Michael stared at the collection, his vision blurring. I don't understand, he said, his voice thick. He never said anything to me about any of this. When that museum won the award, I called to tell him. He just said, "That's nice, son," and changed the subject to his fishing trip. Frank nodded sadly. Some men of our generation, they get locked into patterns they can't break. Your father could face enemy fire without flinching, but telling his son he was proud, that terrified him. Michael sank onto the edge of the bed, the folder open in his lap. Why? His own father, your grandfather, was a real piece of work, Frank said. Cold as ice. Nothing Thomas ever did was good enough for him either. Your dad swore he'd be different with his own kids, but Frank spread his hands. Patterns repeat unless you fight like hell to change them. I did fight, Michael said, a familiar anger rising in his chest. I made damn sure I was different with my daughters. I went to every school play, every soccer game. I told them I was proud every chance I got. And that's where you're stronger than your father ever was, Frank said simply. He knew it too. Wrote about it often enough. Michael looked up sharply. What? Read the letters, Frank said, gesturing to the box. They're yours now, you'll see. Michael selected an envelope at random from the middle of the stack. The postmark was from 1998. The year his firm had landed its first major commercial project. He pulled out 2 pages of lined paper, covered in Thomas's handwriting. Frank. Michael's firm got the contract for that new office building downtown. Saw it in the business section today. 26 stories, $40 million project. My son designing something that will change the city skyline. Can you believe it? I drove by his office yesterday. Thought about going in. Had it all planned out. I'd just drop by, casual-like, say I was in the neighborhood. Tell him I'd seen the news. Tell him I was proud. Got as far as the lobby. Saw him through the glass doors, talking with his team around a table covered with drawings. He looked so confident, so in his element. Nothing like the boy who used to stumble over his words when I asked him about his report card. Couldn't do it, Frank. Stood there watching him for 5 minutes, then walked away. What right do I have to step into his success now? After all, the times I made him feel it wasn't good enough. Lisa sent pictures of the twins last week. They're getting so big. Claire looks just like Michael did at that age. Sometimes I think about what it would be like if I could start over, do it all differently. Not be so hard on him. Tell him the things my father never told me. Too late for that now, I suppose. Tom. Michael read the letter twice, then a third time. His father's voice seemed to emerge from the page, but it was a voice he'd never heard before. Reflective, regretful, proud. He reached for another envelope, this one from 2001. Drove past Michael's house yesterday. The girls were playing in the front yard with the sprinkler. Michael was right there with them, getting soaked, all of them laughing. Reminded me of that time we went fishing at Cedar Lake, when he was maybe 7. The only time I can remember. Just playing with him, no lessons, no correction, just fun. He's the father I should have been, Frank. That's a hard thing to admit, but it's true. Letter after letter revealed pieces of a father Michael had never known. A man who'd tracked his son's career with pride, who'd driven past his house and office, always watching from a distance, held back by his own shame and regret. A grandfather who'd saved birthday cards from grandchildren he rarely saw, who'd kept a picture of Michael's family on his bedside table. Why didn't he ever try to fix things? Michael asked, looking up at Frank with burning eyes. All those years. Fear, Frank said simply. Fear and shame are powerful forces. By the time he realized what he'd done wrong, the distance seemed too great to cross. Frank leaned forward in his chair. He was going to try at the end. Made me promise that if he died before he could make things right, I'd find a way to tell you. And it took you 37 years? Michael couldn't keep the accusation from his voice. Frank nodded, accepting the rebuke. I have no excuse except that I'm a coward too. I told myself you had moved on, that opening old wounds wouldn't help anyone. He gestured to the oxygen tank beside his chair, connected to a thin tube running to his nostrils. Facing your own mortality has a way of clarifying what matters. Michael carefully returned the letters to the box, his mind swimming with contradictions. The father he'd known and the father on these pages seemed like two entirely different men. What do you want from me? Michael asked finally. Nothing you don't want to give, Frank replied. But I'm going to visit Tom's grave on Saturday morning. First time for me, too. I'd like it if you came along. Michael stood, picking up the box. I need time to think about this. Frank nodded. I understand. My cell number is on that card on top of the box. Either way, the letters are yours. As Michael drove home, the box secured on the passenger seat beside him, he felt as though the ground beneath his life had shifted. The narrative he'd constructed, the one that had shaped his identity for decades, that of a son rejected by a cold, disappointed father, was unraveling thread by thread. How many other stories had he gotten wrong? How many assumptions had hardened into certainties over the years? And what would it mean to let go of the anger he'd carried for so long? Michael thought of his daughters, of the open, loving relationship he'd built with them. He thought of all, the times he'd told them he was proud, all the ways he'd made sure they never doubted his love. He'd done that specifically to be different from his father. But what if Thomas had wanted the same thing and simply failed where Michael had succeeded? The box of letters seemed to pulse with unfinished business beside him. Michael knew he had a choice to make. He could put the box away, continue with the life he'd built, the story he'd always believed, or he could face the complexity of a truth he'd never imagined, that his father had loved him, deeply and imperfectly, from a distance he hadn't known how to cross. As he pulled into his driveway, Michael took a deep breath. Saturday was 3 days away. He had some reading to do before then. That evening, Lisa found Michael in his study, surrounded by letters spread across his desk. The box sat open on the floor beside him, half emptied. He'd been reading for hours, lost in his father's words, in the gradual unfolding of a man he'd never truly known. I made dinner, Lisa said softly from the doorway. But I'm guessing you're not hungry. Michael looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. Did you know about any of this? He asked, his voice hoarse. Did my mother ever say anything to you? Lisa came into the room, carefully stepping around the scattered envelopes. She hinted sometimes, said your father wasn't good at showing his feelings, that he regretted how things were between you two. She picked up a letter from the desk, glancing at the faded handwriting. But no, nothing like this. All these years, Michael said, gesturing to the papers around him. All these years I thought he didn't care, that nothing I did measured up to his standards. He ran a hand through his gray hair, and the whole time he was following my career, keeping track of everything I achieved. He just couldn't tell me. Lisa pulled the room's second chair closer to her husband. People get trapped sometimes, in patterns, in expectations, in fear. That's what Frank said. Michael picked up a letter from 2005. Listen to this. Saw Michael's new Civic Center project in the Architectural Digest today. The curved glass front is genius. Catches the light all through the day. Makes the whole building feel alive. Never told you this, Frank, but I wanted to be an architect once. My father said it wasn't a real job for a real man. Pushed me toward the military instead. Sometimes I wonder if that's why I was so hard on Michael when he showed interest in design, afraid he'd face the same disappointment I did. Ironic that I became the disappointment instead. Lisa placed her hand on his arm. What are you going to do? Michael carefully folded the letter, returning it to its envelope. Frank asked me to go to the cemetery with him on Saturday. He's never been either, apparently. Are you going to go? Michael looked around at the scattered evidence of his father's hidden life. the love and pride and regret that Thomas Reynolds had never managed to express directly to his son. "I think I have to," he said finally. "For both of us." The next morning, Michael called his daughters. He needed to tell them about what he'd discovered, needed to hear their voices as he tried to make sense of how drastically his understanding of his father had changed overnight. Claire answered on the third ring, the sounds of a busy hospital in the background. "Dad, everything okay? I'm between patients." "Everything's fine," Michael assured her. He hesitated, unsure how to summarize the upheaval of the past 24 hours. "I found some letters your grandfather wrote. About me. About all of us." "Grandpa Thomas?" Claire sounded surprised. "I thought you two weren't close." "We weren't," Michael confirmed. "That's what makes these letters so unexpected." He took a deep breath. "I'm going to visit his grave on Saturday for the first time." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Wow, Dad. That's big. Do you want me to come with you? I could fly in tomorrow night." Michael felt a rush of warmth for his daughter, always ready to drop everything to support her family. "No, sweetheart. This is something I need to do on my own. Well, not entirely alone. I'm going with an old friend of your grandfather's, but I'll call you after, tell you all about it." "Promise?" Claire asked, and for a moment she sounded like she was 10 years old again, making her father swear he'd check for monsters under the bed. "Promise," Michael said firmly. His call with Abby was similar. Initial surprise, then immediate offers of support. Both conversations left Michael reflecting on how different his relationship with his daughters was from what he'd had with his own father. The ease of saying, "I love you," the comfort of shared emotions, the absence of judgment, all things he'd deliberately cultivated because they'd been missing from his childhood. By Friday night, Michael had read every letter in the box. He'd traced his father's life through correspondence spanning 3 decades, from the struggling veteran trying to readjust to civilian life, to the regretful father watching his son's success from a distance, to the dying man making peace with his failures. It was like assembling a puzzle whose final image looked nothing like what he'd expected. In the very bottom of the box, underneath all the letters, Michael found one final envelope. Unlike the others, it wasn't addressed to Frank. Instead, his own name was written on the front in his father's handwriting. With trembling fingers, Michael opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, dated just 2 weeks before Thomas died. "Michael, if you're reading this, it means I've finally found the courage to tell you what I should have said years ago, or I've run out of time and Frank has kept his promise to give you my letters. I've never been good with words, not the important kind anyway. Orders and instructions came easy. Feelings were always harder. I want you to know that I am proud of you, prouder than I can say. You've built a life of meaning and purpose. You've created beautiful things that will outlast both of us. Most importantly, you've been a better father to your girls than I ever was to you. I know I hurt you. I know I made you feel like you weren't enough. The truth is, I was the one who wasn't enough, not brave enough to break the cycle my own father started, not wise enough to see that I was pushing away the person I most wanted to connect with. I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I hope someday you might understand that I loved you the best way I knew how, even if that way was broken. Your E. Father saw Thomas. Michael read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it back in its envelope. He sat in silence for a long time afterward, the weight of decades shifting inside him. The anger that had been his constant companion when he thought of his father was still there, but it was changing shape, making room for something more complex, a sadness for what might have been, a grief for connections never made. Saturday morning dawned clear and cool. Michael dressed carefully, not formally, but with purpose. Dark jeans, a blue button-down shirt, the watch his father had given him for his college graduation. He'd worn it rarely over the years, but today it felt right. Lisa kissed him at the door. "Do you want me to drive you?" she asked. "I could wait, in the car." Michael shook his head. "I need to do this myself." The Ridgeview Hotel was only a 5-minute detour on the way to Pine Grove Cemetery. Michael texted Frank when he arrived, and a few minutes later, the older man emerged from the lobby, moving slowly but deliberately. He wore a navy blazer with a military pin on the lapel, his oxygen tank trailing beside him on a small cart. "Wasn't sure you'd come," Frank said as he carefully lowered himself into Michael's car. "I wasn't sure either," Michael admitted, "but after reading the letters, I need to finish this." They drove in silence for much of the journey, each man lost in his own thoughts. As they passed through the cemetery gates, Frank spoke again. He talked about this place sometimes in his later letters, said when his time came he wanted to be somewhere peaceful with trees, somewhere you might want to visit someday. Michael tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "He knew I wouldn't come." "He hoped you might, eventually," Frank corrected, gently. "Hope's a powerful thing. Keeps people going when nothing else will." Michael parked near the cemetery office, then consulted the small map the receptionist gave him. Thomas Reynolds was buried in the east section, beneath an old oak tree. As they walked slowly along the path, Frank's oxygen tank making a soft whooshing sound with each breath, Michael felt a strange sense of inevitability, as if all the years of avoiding this moment had only made it more necessary, more weighted. With meaning, they found the grave without difficulty. The headstone was simple, gray granite with Thomas's name, rank, and dates of birth and death. Below that was a single line: "Beloved husband and father." Michael stared at the word beloved. Had he ever felt that way about his father? Had Thomas ever felt beloved by his son? Frank stood slightly behind him, giving him space. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Then Frank reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small worn object, a military challenge coin. "Your father gave me this after a particularly rough mission," he explained, holding it out for Michael to see. The metal disc bore the insignia of their unit, worn smooth, in places from decades of handling. "Told me as long as I had it, I'd find my way home." Frank knelt painfully beside the grave and placed the coin atop the headstone. "Brought you home too, old friend," he murmured, "in my own slow way." He struggled to rise, and Michael instinctively offered his arm for support. As Frank regained his footing, he gestured to the grave. "I'll give you some time alone. I'll be waiting by the car." Michael watched him go, then turned back to his father's headstone. He'd imagined this moment so many times over the years, always, with a sense of defiance, standing here to prove that Thomas's disapproval had never broken him. But now, with the letter's revelation still fresh in his mind, he felt only a profound sadness for all that had been lost, all the words never spoken between them. From his pocket, Michael withdrew the letter addressed to him, the one his father had written in his final weeks. He knelt and placed it against the headstone, weighing it down with a small stone. "I got your message," he said quietly. 37 years late. But I got it. The breeze stirred the leaves of the oak tree overhead, casting dappled shadows across the grave. Michael placed his hand on the cool granite, feeling the engraved letters of his father's name beneath his fingers. "I wish we'd had more time," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I wish you'd found the courage to speak while you were still here, or that I'd found the wisdom to look past my own hurt and see yours." Michael fell silent, realizing there was no perfect thing to say, no words that could encompass the complicated tangle of love, resentment, pride, and regret that had defined their relationship. Instead, he simply stayed there, hand resting on his father's headstone, allowing himself to feel the connection that had always existed between them, however strained, however imperfect. After a time, he couldn't have said how long, Michael rose to his feet. He looked once more at the grave, at the military coin gleaming in the sunlight, at the letter waiting to be carried away by wind or rain. "Goodbye, Dad," he said softly. As he walked back toward the car, where Frank waited patiently, Michael felt something shift inside him, not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. The first step on a journey he'd been avoiding his entire adult life. He thought of his daughters, of the open, loving relationship they shared, how deliberately he'd built that in opposition to his own childhood. And he realized that in his own way, his father had helped shape that too, not by his presence, but by the space he'd left, the lessons Michael had learned from his absence. Some gifts come wrapped in pain. Some messages take a lifetime to deliver. And sometimes the most important journeys are the ones we resist the longest. On the drive back from the cemetery, Frank's breathing seemed more labored, the portable oxygen tank working overtime to keep up with his needs. Michael glanced over with concern as they stopped at a red light. "Should I take you to the hospital instead of the hotel?" he asked. Frank shook his head, a faint smile on his thin face. "No hospitals today. This is just how it is now. Some days are better than others." He adjusted the tube running to his nostrils. "Besides, there's more I'd like to tell you if you're willing to listen." Michael nodded, making a decision. "Let's get lunch. There's a quiet place near the lake that has good food and comfortable chairs." 20 minutes later, they were seated by a window overlooking the water at Harbor View Cafe. Frank had insisted on walking in under his own power, though Michael stayed close, ready to offer support if needed. The waitress, noticing Frank's oxygen tank and labored movements, quietly gave them a corner table away from the bustle of the main dining area. After they ordered, soup and half sandwiches that Frank admitted were about all he could manage these days, Michael finally asked the question that had been bothering him since they left the cemetery. "Why did you wait so long to find me? My father's been gone for 37 years. Frank's weathered hands fidgeted with his napkin. "That's the question I've been asking myself every day since my diagnosis." He looked up, meeting Michael's gaze directly. "The simple answer is that I'm a coward. The harder answer is that I convinced myself it wasn't my place to interfere." Michael waited, sensing there was more. "I nearly contacted you about 15 years ago," Frank continued. "Had your office number written down, picked up the phone half a dozen times. But then I'd think, who am I to reopen old wounds? Maybe you'd made your peace with things. Maybe knowing how your father really felt would just make the pain worse, not better." "So what changed?" Michael asked. Frank gestured to the oxygen tank beside him. "Stage 4 lung cancer has a way of clarifying what matters. The doctors gave me 6 months back in January. I figure I've got maybe 2 left if I'm lucky." He offered a wry smile. "Turns out the prospect of dying with unfinished business is more frightening than making an uncomfortable phone call." Their food arrived, momentarily pausing the conversation. As they began to eat, Frank pulled a small photo from his wallet and slid it across the table. "Your father and me, 1970. Just kids, really." Michael picked up the faded photograph. 2 young men in military uniforms stood arm in arm, grinning at the camera with the unmixed confidence of youth. One was unmistakably his father, taller, leaner, with a hint of the stern expression that would become more pronounced in later years. The other must be Frank, with a full head of dark hair and a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Hard to believe we were ever that young," Frank said softly. "Or that stupid. I started smoking the day I turned 18. Thought it made me look tough." Michael studied the image, trying to reconcile this carefree young man with the father he'd known. "He looks happy." "He was sometimes," Frank replied, "before the worst of what we saw over there. Your father was actually the joker of our unit, believe it or not. Could do impressions of all the officers that would have us doubled over laughing." Michael looked up in surprise. "My father? The same man who could silence a room with a look?" Frank nodded. "Vietnam changed him, changed all of us, but Tom, he took certain things harder than most, felt responsible for the men we lost even when there was nothing he could have done." Frank took a careful sip of water. When he came home, he couldn't switch it off. That need to be in control, to keep everyone safe by being tough, by preparing for the worst. "So that's why he was so hard on me," Michael said, more statement than question. "Partly," Frank agreed. "But it was more than that. He talked about it in his letters. How he'd look at you and see all this potential, this bright future, and it terrified him. He was so afraid you'd get hurt by the world that he ended up hurting you himself. They ate in silence for a few minutes, Michael processing this new perspective on his father, adding it to the complex picture that had been emerging since Frank's phone call. "Did he ever talk about my grandfather?" Michael asked eventually. In the letters, he mentioned him a few times. Frank's expression darkened. "William Reynolds was a cold, hard man. Made your father look like a teddy bear in comparison. Physical with his discipline, if you understand my meaning." Michael nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. "Dad never hit me, not once, no matter how angry he got." "That was deliberate," Frank said. "He swore he'd never raise a hand to his children, even before you were born. It was one line he refused to cross." Frank paused, considering his next words carefully. "The sad part is your father thought that by not hitting you, by just being verbally tough instead, he was being a much better father than his own dad. And in some ways, he was." "A low bar," Michael commented, but without the bitterness that would have colored such a statement days earlier. "The lowest," Frank agreed. "That's how these things go, generation to generation. Each one thinking they're doing better than the last, not realizing they're still passing down the damage, just in a different form." Michael thought of his own parenting, how consciously he'd worked to be emotionally available to his daughters, to praise their efforts, to make sure they never doubted his love. Had he overcorrected in some ways? Been too lenient where his father had been too strict? "Until someone breaks the chain," Michael said quietly. Frank nodded. "Which you did? From everything your father told me about how you were with your girls." They finished their meal, talking more about Thomas Reynolds, stories from his military days, anecdotes Frank remembered from their long friendship, insights into the man Michael had never fully known. With each story, the caricature Michael had carried in his mind for decades, the disapproving, emotionally distant father, gained more dimension, more humanity. After lunch, Michael drove Frank back to the Ridgeview Hotel. The older man was visibly tired now, his earlier energy drained by the emotional morning and the effort of eating. "Would you like me to come up, help you get settled?" Michael offered as he pulled into the parking lot. Frank shook his head. "I can manage, but—" He hesitated. "I'm here until Wednesday. If you wanted to talk more, maybe bring your wife." "I'd like that." Michael was surprised by how quickly he nodded. "I'd like that too. I'll call you tomorrow, we can figure out a time." As Frank began to lever himself out of the passenger seat, he turned back. "There's one more thing. Your father left something with me, for you. It's in my room. I didn't bring it today because, well, I wasn't sure how things would go." "What is it?" Michael asked. "His service medals and his father's pocket watch. The only thing of value the old man ever gave him." Frank's eyes held Michael's. "He wanted you to have them. Said maybe someday you could pass them down to your grandkids, tell them about their great-grandfather who flew planes in Vietnam." Michael felt a tightness in his throat. "I'll come by tomorrow to pick them up." That evening, as Lisa prepared dinner, Michael sat at the kitchen island, scrolling through his phone. He'd been quiet since returning home, processing the morning's events and his lunch conversation with Frank. "You're a million miles away," Lisa observed as she chopped vegetables for a salad. "How are you feeling about everything?" Michael set his phone down. "I'm not sure yet. It's like finding out the story you've been telling yourself your whole life was missing half the pages." Lisa nodded encouragingly, giving him space to continue. "Always thought it was simple," Michael said. "My father was cold and critical. I wasn't the son he wanted. End of story." He ran a hand through his hair. "But now I find out he was proud of me all along, that he kept track of my career, saved articles about my work, that he wanted to reach out but didn't know how. Does that change how you feel about him?" Lisa asked gently. Michael considered this. Yes and no. The hurt is still real. The damage was done whether he meant it or not. He paused, collecting his thoughts. "But I'm starting to see him as a whole person, someone shaped by his own pain, trying to do better than his father did even if he still fell short." That's a lot to process, Lisa said, reaching across the island to squeeze his hand. Frank invited us to visit him tomorrow. I said we would. Michael glanced at his wife. Is that okay? Of course, Lisa smiled. I'd like to meet him. Michael nodded, then picked up his phone again, turning it to show Lisa the screen. I've been looking at flights for next weekend. Lisa leaned closer to see what he was looking at. Boston and Chicago? I want to tell the girls about all this in person, about their grandfather. Michael set the phone down again. And I want to give them these. He reached into his pocket and pulled out two small objects. The military challenge coin Frank had placed on Thomas's grave, and a smooth stone from beside the headstone. I went back, Michael explained, seeing Lisa's questioning look. After I dropped Frank at his hotel, I don't know why exactly. Just felt like I needed a moment alone there. He turned the items over in his palm. I want Claire and Abby to have these. Something to connect them to him, even if they never really knew him. Lisa came around the island and wrapped her arms around her husband. I think that's a wonderful idea. Later that night, unable to sleep, Michael found himself in his study again. The box of letters sat on his desk where he'd left it. Beside, it was a leather-bound photo album he'd dug out of the hall closet, one of the few items he'd kept from his parents' house after his mother died. Michael opened the album, turning slowly through the pages. Photos of his childhood, school portraits, family vacations, his high school graduation. He'd looked at these images countless times over the years, always focusing on his own face, his mother's smile. Now he found himself studying his father, in each picture. There, at Michael's 10th birthday, Thomas standing stiffly beside the cake, not quite smiling, but with a hand resting lightly on his son's shoulder. At a school science fair, Thomas examining Michael's project with an intensity that Michael had always interpreted as criticism, but which now looked more like genuine interest. At Michael's college graduation, father and son shaking hands formally, while his mother looked on, a moment Michael remembered as awkward, his father's congratulations feeling perfunctory. You were proud, Michael whispered to the image of his father. Why couldn't you just say it? He continued turning pages until he reached the last photos, ones taken at family gatherings after his daughters were born. In most, Thomas stood, at the edge of the frame, separate but present. But there was one that made Michael pause, a photo he'd never paid much attention to before. It showed Thomas sitting in an armchair, baby Claire asleep on his chest. His expression was soft, unguarded, looking at his granddaughter with a tenderness Michael couldn't remember ever being directed at him. The photo was slightly blurry, taken without Thomas's awareness, capturing a rare moment of emotional openness. Michael stared at the image for a long time. Even then, even with all the distance between them, there had been love. Imperfect, unexpressed, but real. He closed the album and leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the day settling into his bones. Outside his window, the night was clear, stars visible above the neighborhood rooftops. Michael thought about cycles and chains, about the messages passed between generations, spoken and unspoken, intended and accidental. He thought about his father standing outside his office building all those years ago, too afraid to come in and say he was proud, about Frank, carrying the burden of a promise for decades before finally finding the courage to fulfill it. And he thought about the message that had finally reached him, 37 years late but right on time, that love could exist even where it couldn't be spoken, that understanding could come even after the chance for reconciliation was gone. Tomorrow he would visit Frank again. Next weekend he would fly to see his daughters. The story wasn't finished. Maybe stories like this never truly ended, but continued across generations, evolving as they went. For now, though, Michael simply sat with the knowledge that had changed everything, that his father had loved him in his broken, imperfect way, and somehow, impossibly, that was enough to begin healing wounds nearly 4 decades old. The following weekend found Michael walking through Boston's Logan Airport. Scanning the arrivals area for his daughter, he spotted Claire waving enthusiastically from near the coffee shop. her familiar smile a welcome sight after the emotional turbulence of the past week. "Dad," she called, hurrying over to embrace him. "You look good. Different somehow." Michael hugged her tightly. "Different how?" Claire stepped back, studying his face. "I don't know. Lighter, maybe? Less tense around the eyes." They collected his small carry-on bag and headed to Claire's car. The early October weather was crisp and clear, the trees along the highway beginning their transformation into fall colors. As Claire drove toward her home in the suburbs, Michael filled her in on the details he hadn't shared during their brief phone conversations. Frank's appearance in his life, the box of letters, the visit to Thomas's grave. "I still can't believe it," Claire said, shaking her head. "All these years you thought Grandpa didn't care about your work and he was secretly following your whole career." "People can hold contradictory feelings at the same time," Michael replied. "I think he was genuinely critical of my choices, genuinely worried I was making a mistake. But he was also genuinely proud of what I accomplished." Claire glanced at him. "That's surprisingly understanding of you, Dad." Michael smiled, faintly. "I've had some time to think about it." At Claire's house, they were greeted by her husband Paul and their two children, 10-year-old Ryan and 7-year-old Lily. The kids tackled Michael with hugs before racing back to the backyard where they'd been playing. "They've been excited all day," Paul explained, taking Michael's bag. "Ryan keeps saying his grandpa is the best at building forts." Michael laughed. "I'd better not disappoint him then." That evening, after dinner and after the children were in bed, Michael sat with Claire and Paul in their comfortable living room. From his pocket, he pulled out a small velvet pouch. "I brought something I wanted to show you," he said, loosening the drawstring. He tipped the contents into his palm. The military challenge coin Frank had left at Thomas's grave, now attached to a simple chain. "What is that?" Claire asked, leaning forward to look. "It's a military challenge coin. Your grandfather's unit, in Vietnam." Michael handed it to her. "His friend Frank left it on his grave last week. I went back later and, well, I thought you might want to have it." Claire turned the coin over in her fingers, examining the worn metal emblem. "This was Grandpa's?" "Not exactly," Michael explained. "Frank said your grandfather gave it to him during the war, told him as long as he had it, he'd find his way home. It meant a lot to Frank." Michael paused. "I'm flying to Chicago tomorrow to see Abby. I have something similar for her, a stone from the grave and one of your grandfather's medals that Frank had been keeping." Claire looked up, her eyes bright with unexpected tears. "I wish I'd known him better. I mean, I remember him being quiet, kind of scary sometimes, but I was so young when he died." "I wish I'd known him better too," Michael said softly. "And I wish I'd given you kids more of a chance to know him, even just through stories. But I didn't have many good ones to tell, or at least, I didn't think I did." "And now?" Claire asked. Michael considered this. "Now I see him as a whole person, flawed, damaged in some ways, but trying. He broke some cycles from his own childhood, even if he couldn't break them all." He gestured to the coin in Claire's hand. "I'd like you to have that, to pass down to Ryan or Lily someday, along with the full story, the complicated truth, not just the simple version." Later, as Paul excused himself to go check on the kids, Claire turned to her father with a thoughtful expression. "You know what I remember most about Grandpa?" she said. "That Christmas when I was maybe 5 and he built me that dollhouse. Do you remember that?" Michael shook his head. "I remember the dollhouse, but I thought Mom bought it." "No, he made it," Claire insisted. "I remember watching him in the garage, measuring and cutting all the tiny pieces. He let me hand him the nails." She smiled at the memory. "He didn't talk much, but he'd show me what he was doing, step by step. I thought he was so smart, being able to build something so perfect from just pieces of wood." Michael stared at his daughter, this simple story landing like a revelation. "He never told me he was building that. I was probably working late, as usual." The irony wasn't lost on him, how he'd followed in his father's footsteps in at least one way, letting work sometimes take precedence over family. Maybe that's why he didn't mention it, Claire suggested, but I remember him saying it was our secret project. When Christmas came, he just stood back and let everyone think it came from a store. She looked at the challenge coin again. I'll tell Ryan and Lily about him, the real him, as much as we know. The visit with Abby in Chicago the next day followed a similar pattern. Michael shared the stories, gave her the small stone and one of Thomas's service medals that Frank had kept all these years. But Abby's memories of her grandfather were even more limited than Claire's. She'd been only 3 when he died. Mostly know him through photos, she admitted as they sat in her downtown apartment, the Chicago skyline visible through the windows. And through you, I guess, all the ways you tried to be different from him. Michael nodded, understanding the truth in her words. I defined myself in opposition to him for so long. Everything I did as a father was a reaction. If he was distant, I'd be present. If he was critical, I'd be supportive. You were a great dad, Abby said quickly. Are a great dad. I tried to be, Michael acknowledged, but I'm realizing that in some ways your grandfather was trying too. He just had less to work with, less understanding of what was broken in himself. Abby studied the medal in her hand, a bronze star with a ribbon awarded for heroism in combat. Do you know how he earned this? Michael shook his head. Frank told me the story, but it's his to tell. I'm going to put you and Claire in touch with him while there's still time. He can tell you more about who your grandfather really was. Before leaving Chicago, Michael took Abby to dinner at her favorite restaurant. As they waited for dessert, she asked the question he'd been expecting from both his daughters. So what happens now? With all this new understanding about Grandpa? Michael considered her question carefully. I'm not sure there's an end to something like this. It's more like the story continues, but with better information. He stirred his coffee thoughtfully. I'm going back to see Frank next week. His doctors don't think he has much time left. I want to hear more of his stories, record some of them maybe so they don't get lost. That's a good idea, Abby nodded. Maybe Claire and I could video call in for some of it, if he's up for that. I think he'd like that. Michael smiled. 2 weeks later, Michael sat beside Frank's hospital bed. The older man's decline had accelerated suddenly, and he'd been admitted 3 days earlier with pneumonia. The oxygen mask covering most of his face couldn't hide the smile in his eyes as he looked at the tablet Michael held, showing Claire and Abby on a video call. Your grandfather would have been so proud of you both, Frank said, his voice weak, but clear. He kept your pictures in his wallet, showed them to anyone who'd look. Michael watched as his daughters asked questions about their grandfather, what he was like as a young man, what he did in the war, what made him laugh. Frank answered as best he could, his breathing labored but his memory sharp. After 15 minutes, the nurse indicated that Frank needed to rest. We'll call again tomorrow, Claire promised. I'd like that, Frank said, though something in his expression suggested he knew there might not be a tomorrow. After ending the call, Michael set the tablet aside. Thank you, he said simply, for doing this, for finding me, for keeping your promise. Frank's hand found Michael's, his grip surprisingly strong. Tom would be proud of how you turned out. Even prouder of how you've handled all this. I hope so, Michael said. Frank's eyes drifted closed, his breathing evening out as the medication took effect. Michael sat with him until he was certain the older man was asleep, then quietly left the room. In the hospital corridor, he checked his phone. There was a text from Lisa asking how Frank was doing, and one from Claire with a photo attached. She'd framed the challenge coin in a shadow box, along with a printed copy of one of Thomas's letters that Michael had shared with her. Beside it was the old photograph of Thomas holding baby Claire. Ryan asked about this today, her message read. I told him all about his great-grandfather, the pilot. He wants to know more stories when you get home. Michael smiled, typing a quick reply. As he walked through the hospital parking lot, he felt the weight of the past week settling into something new. Not quite peace, but understanding. A completion of a circle that had begun 37 years ago when he'd stood at the back of his father's funeral, unable to approach the casket. 2 days later, Frank Wilson passed away peacefully in his sleep. Michael was there, having spent most of the previous 48 hours at the hospital. In Frank's personal effects was an envelope addressed to Michael, containing a final letter from Frank himself. Michael, if you're reading this, I've finally run out of time. I want you to know that these last weeks have meant more to me than I can say. Keeping my promise to your father lifted a weight I'd carried for decades. There's one last thing Tom asked me to tell you, something he wrote in his final letter to me but couldn't bring himself to put in the letter he wrote to you. He said, "Tell Michael that the best thing I ever did in my life was being his father, even if I made a mess of it most of the time. And tell him that the man he became, that was in spite of me, not because of me, and that makes his accomplishments all the more remarkable. Your father was wrong about that last part. We're all shaped by those who came before us, the good and the bad, the spoken and the unspoken. You are who you are partly because of him, just as your daughters are who they are partly because of you. That's how it works, this business of fathers and sons, parents and children. We pass along what we can, hoping the best parts stick and the worst parts fade. Sometimes it takes generations for the full story to be told. Thank you for allowing an old man to keep his promise, and for giving your father a chance to be heard even so many years later. Your friend, Frank." 6 months later, on a bright spring morning, Michael returned to Pine Grove Cemetery. This time, he wasn't alone. Lisa walked beside him, her hand in his. Behind them came Claire and Paul with their children and Abby with her boyfriend David. They gathered around Thomas Reynolds' grave, now adorned with fresh flowers. Michael had been coming regularly since that first visit, sometimes alone, sometimes with Lisa, each time finding it easier than the last. "So this is where great-grandpa is buried?" Ryan asked, peering at the headstone with curiosity rather than sadness. "That's right," Michael nodded. "The grandfather I told you stories about. The one who flew planes in the war?" Lily piped up. "That's him," Michael confirmed, smiling at his granddaughter. "Would you like to hear another story about him?" As the family settled on the grass around the grave, Michael began to speak, sharing memories both painful and precious, weaving together the complicated truth of the man Thomas Reynolds had been. Not a hero, not a villain, but a human being, flawed and loving and trying his best with the tools he had. The breeze stirred the leaves of the oak tree overhead, dappling the sunlight across 3 generations of a family finally connected. To their past, the broken chain of understanding at last repaired by a message that had taken 37 years to deliver.